Let me tell you something, and I'm saying this honestly, not as a joke, not as a punchline, but as a realization that hit me harder the more I actually listened instead of reacting. Because when people hear Islam and Jesus in the same sentence, they assume contradiction, conflict, or controversy. But what stunned me was discovering that in Islam, Jesus, Isa, peace be upon him, is not rejected, not erased, not minimized, but honored, revered, respected, and believed in as one of the greatest messengers of God, born miraculously, a sign to humanity. And when I learned that Muslims don't just believe in Jesus, but also believe in his return, that's when my brain stopped looking for arguments and started asking real questions, because this isn't some fringe idea or symbolic metaphor. It's a core belief that Jesus will return near the end of time, not as a new religion, not to abolish truth, but to restore justice, to break oppression, to expose falsehood. And that shook me because I realized how different this was from the version of Islam I had been casually handed through headlines, stereotypes, and noise. And suddenly I saw a faith talking about accountability, humility, and moral clarity in a way that felt deeply serious about the future of humanity, not just spiritually, but ethically, because the return of Jesus in Islam isn't about spectacle. It's about responsibility. It's about a world drowning in arrogance, deception, and power games, and a reminder that truth doesn't belong to empires, media, or mobs. It belongs to God. And what really got me was how Islam places Jesus as a servant of God, not a symbol for political comfort, not a mascot for culture wars, but a man of truth who stands against injustice. And that idea forces you to look inward instead of outward, because if Jesus returns to establish justice, then the uncomfortable question becomes, where do we stand when truth arrives without asking for our approval? And I found myself thinking about how modern life trains us to cheer for sides instead of principles, identities instead of integrity. And here is Islam saying that when Jesus returns, false authority will collapse, arrogance will shatter, and people will be judged not by labels, but by actions. And that hit me personally because it stripped away the luxury of sarcasm and made me confront sincerity, because believing in the return of Jesus isn't passive optimism. It's a warning that history is not random, that power is temporary, and that moral consequences are real. And what surprised me most was the respect embedded in this belief. No insults, no mockery, no dismissal of others, just clarity that Jesus is a messenger of God and will return by God's will. And that realization made me rethink how shallow most public conversations are, because we argue over surface differences while ignoring shared accountability. And Islam doesn't present Jesus as a distant myth, but as a living responsibility, someone whose return demands that people examine their honesty, their justice, their humility, and suddenly faith stops being a comfort blanket and becomes a mirror. And I'll admit it, that's unsettling, because mirrors don't flatter, they reveal. And maybe that's why this idea feels so powerful, because it doesn't ask you to clap, it asks you to change. It doesn't offer escape, it offers correction. And in a world addicted to distraction, the Islamic belief in the return of Jesus feels like a quiet but terrifying reminder that truth has an ending point, that injustice has an expiration date, and that no amount of noise can cancel accountability. And when I understood that, I stopped seeing this belief as something foreign and started seeing it as something deeply human, a call to prepare, not with slogans, but with character, not with superiority, but with humility. Because if Jesus returns as Islam describes, then the real shock won't be who he is, it will be who we are when he arrives. Let me continue this thought, because the more I sat with it, the more it refused to leave me alone. And that's when I realized this idea of the return of Jesus in Islam isn't meant to sit quietly in the background of belief. It's meant to disturb comfort, because Islam doesn't talk about the end of time as entertainment or fear porn. It talks about it as a moral audit. And Jesus returning isn't about spectacle, it's about exposure. Exposure of hypocrisy, exposure of false certainty, exposure of the way we bend truth to fit our convenience. And that's what really unsettled me. Because when a belief tells you that even the most respected figures, the loudest voices, the most powerful institutions will be measured by justice and not by reputation, that belief doesn't flatter anyone. And Islam is brutally honest about that. It says that when Jesus returns, he will stand for truth without negotiating with ego, culture, or power. And I started thinking about how much of modern life is built on performance, on appearances, on curated morality. And here comes a belief saying that none of that survives the arrival of truth, that intentions matter, actions matter, humility matters. And suddenly faith isn't about feeling special. It's about being accountable. And that's a hard pill to swallow in a world that celebrates self-importance, because Islam doesn't frame Jesus as someone who comes to validate people's identities. He comes to correct people's directions. And that's a massive difference, because correction requires surrender. And surrender is something modern culture absolutely hates. We want control. We want narratives where we're always right, always justified, always the hero. And Islam says no, even Jez. Us returns as a servant of God, not as a ruler seeking worship. And that inversion of power shook me, because it flips everything we think leadership is. It says real authority is obedience to truth, not dominance over others. And I couldn't ignore how consistent that was with everything attributed to Jesus's character: humility, justice, compassion without weakness, strength without arrogance. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized this belief isn't trying to erase anyone's faith. It's trying to recenter humanity around accountability to God. And that made me question how casually we talk about morality today, how easily we excuse ourselves while condemning others. Because Islam doesn't let you outsource responsibility. It doesn't let you hide behind group identity. It tells you that when Jesus returns, excuses will be irrelevant, sincerity will be visible, and actions will speak louder than intentions we never fulfilled. And I thought about how terrifying and liberating that is at the same time. Terrifying because you can't hide. Liberating because truth finally cuts through noise. And maybe that's why this belief has survived centuries, because it doesn't depend on trends. It doesn't need constant reinvention. It stands there quietly saying history has meaning, justice has an endpoint, and arrogance has a limit. And when I reflected on that, I realized the real shock isn't that Islam believes in the return of Jesus. The real shock is that it takes that belief seriously enough to demand change right now, not later, not someday, but in how you live, how you speak, how you treat others, how honest you are when no one is watching. Because if Jesus returns as Islam describes, then preparation isn't about prediction. It's about purification of intentions, of actions, of hearts. And that idea doesn't belong to one culture or one group. It belongs to anyone brave, enough to face truth without filters. And that's why this belief stayed with me, because it doesn't let you point fingers. It makes you look inward. And in a world obsessed with blaming everyone else, that might be the most radical idea of all. Let me take this even further, because by this point, it stopped being something I was merely learning and started becoming something I was wrestling with. Because once you accept that the return of Jesus in Islam is not symbolic comfort, but a real moral reckoning, you can't unsee what it implies about the world we're living in right now. And that's where it really gets uncomfortable. Because Islam doesn't describe the end times as a sudden surprise for innocent people. It describes it as the result of long-term moral decay. Arrogance normalized, truth diluted, justice postponed. And when Jesus returns in that framework, he doesn't arrive to applaud humanity's progress. He arrives to correct its direction. And that forced me to think about how often we confuse advancement with wisdom, how we celebrate technology while neglecting character, how we talk endlessly about rights but avoid responsibility. And Islam cuts straight through that by saying that the return of Jesus will expose how empty power is when it's not grounded in obedience to God. And that idea stripped away a lot of modern illusions for me, because we live in a time where confidence is mistaken for truth and volume is mistaken for authority. But Islam says when Jesus returns, none of that matters. What matters is sincerity, justice, and submission to God's will. And that's a terrifying thought for a world built on ego, because ego hates accountability, it hates limits, it hates being told that it's not the center of reality. And yet this belief calmly insists that no matter how loud humanity becomes, truth will eventually speak louder. And I started noticing how his belief doesn't encourage fear as much as it encourages preparation. Not preparation through hoarding or panic, but preparation through moral discipline, through humility, through honesty, through resisting corruption, even when it's profitable. And suddenly, faith stops being abstract theology and becomes a daily responsibility. Because if Jesus returns to restore justice, then injustice today is not just a social problem, it's a spiritual failure. And that reframing hit me hard, because it means neutrality is not innocent. Silence is not safe, and comfort is not virtue. And Islam doesn't let you escape that conclusion. It tells you plainly that when Jesus returns, he will stand against deception, no matter how popular it is. And that made me reflect on how often we trade truth for acceptance, how often we soften principles to avoid discomfort. And here is a belief that says truth doesn't negotiate with fear. It arrives whether you're ready or not. And the only real question is whether you lived in alignment with it before it arrived. And the more I sat with this, the more I realized how deeply this belief challenges modern spirituality, because modern spirituality wants reassurance without correction, peace without discipline, meaning without sacrifice, and Islam refuses that shortcut. It says real peace comes after submission, real justice comes after accountability, and real hope comes after truth. And that's why the return of Jesus in Islam feels less like an end-time fantasy and more like a final standard, a reminder that history is moving toward judgment, not chaos, toward clarity, not confusion. And that realization changed how I looked at faith altogether. Because suddenly belief wasn't about claiming moral superiority. It was about preparing to be questioned, and not by people, but by God. And that's humbling in a way nothing else is, because you can argue why people. You can out-talk critics, you can manipulate narratives, but you can't negotiate with truth. And Islam is very clear about that. And maybe that's why this belief doesn't fade with time, because it doesn't depend on trends, it depends on reality. And once you understand that, you stop asking when Jesus will return and start asking whether you are living in a way that could survive the moment truth finally stands in front of you.